June 6th, 1944. The wind rolled cold across the English Channel. It carried the smell of salt, oil, and fear. On the horizon, an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen moved steadily toward the French coast. Nearly 7,000 ships, destroyers, transports, landing craft, all converging on a single strip of shoreline that would soon be written into history under one word: Normandy. Inside the landing craft, the men said little. Helmets rattled, dog tags clicked softly against rifles. They had been told the Germans were waiting. They just didn't know how many. Somewhere ahead, past the gray waves and the fog of early dawn, the Atlantic wall stood, an iron curtain of concrete, mines, and machine guns, built to stop exactly what was about to happen. The ramp dropped, and hell opened. The water turned red as MG-42s spat a storm of bullets. Men dove into the surf, their packs dragging them down. The lucky ones made it to the shingle, pressed flat beneath, praying for one more breath. What unfolded on that beach was not chaos. It was calculation. Every movement, every sacrifice, every meter gained had been planned years in advance. Because behind the horror of that morning lay one of the most intricate operations in military history. Operation Overlord, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But this invasion wasn't just about bravery. It was about engineering, deception, and logistics on a scale never before seen. From the floating harbors that defied physics to the fake armies built from rubber and radio waves, every piece of the Allied war machine had been tuned to perfection. And it all had to work on one single day. The beaches were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. 5 landing zones, 5 stories of unimaginable courage. But as dawn gave way to daylight, one of those names, Omaha, would burn itself into history as the bloodiest stretch of sand ever fought upon. Behind the gunfire, the roar of naval bombardment echoed across the channel. Battleships like USS Texas and HMS Rodney fired shells the size of small cars, flattening bunkers miles inland. The sky itself trembled. Allied bombers thundered overhead. B-17s, Lancasters, Liberators, raining steel on the German defenses. Yet still, the defenders stood. The Atlantic Wall, built under the genius and madness of Hitler's engineers, was doing exactly what it was meant to. Every pillbox, every minefield, every interlocking field of fire had been laid to ensure no man could cross that beach alive. But they did. Because for the Allies, there was no turning back. By mid-morning, the beaches were littered with wrecks, burnt-out tanks, shattered landing craft, and thousands of bodies. Yet among the chaos, the tide began to shift. Groups of men began to crawl forward, inch by inch, up the bluffs. Engineers cleared paths through minefields. Rangers scaled cliffs under fire. Naval gunners zeroed in on enemy fortifications, cracking them open one by one. And then, against every odd, a message crackled over the radio. Omaha Beach, secured. It was far from over, but the impossible had been done. As the smoke lifted from the beaches of Normandy, the true scale of Operation Overlord began to unfold. Behind those few hours of combat were months, even years of preparation, secrecy, and sacrifice. Every rifle fired, every tank landed, every paratrooper dropped behind enemy lines was part of a colossal plan, one designed to crack Fortress Europe from within. From London war rooms to desert testing grounds, the Allies had built an army unlike any before, not just in size, but in precision. They had learned from the disasters of Dunkirk, the blunders of Dieppe, and the slow grind of Italy. Now, all of that experience was converging on one day, D-Day. Yet even as the beaches were won, new challenges loomed ahead. The Allies had only secured a thin foothold on the continent, and the German counterattack was inevitable. Every general on both sides knew the next 48 hours would decide the future of Europe, and somewhere, deep inside the shattered ruins of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, German commanders were regrouping. The order was simple: throw them back into the sea. The stage was set for the next act, one that would turn a beachhead into a battlefield, and a gamble into victory. By the evening of June 6th, the beaches of Normandy were secure, but only barely. The price of victory was staggering: over 10,000 Allied casualties in a single day. The sand was still soaked with blood, the air thick with smoke, the cries of the wounded echoing over the surf. The invasion had succeeded, but the fight for France had only begun. Inland, paratroopers who had dropped behind enemy lines during the night were still scattered and surrounded. Many had landed miles from their intended zones. They fought small, desperate battles in hedgerows and villages, cutting communication lines, seizing bridges, ambushing convoys. These isolated pockets of men, often outnumbered and undersupplied, were the first to hold back German reinforcements trying to reach the beaches. Among them were the men of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, America's best. Their mission had been chaos from the start. Low clouds, flak fire, and poor visibility had thrown the entire drop into confusion. Yet, despite the disorder, they accomplished what the plan demanded: disruption. German commanders, unsure of the Allied strength or direction, hesitated. That hesitation gave the beachheads time to breathe. But the German High Command was already moving. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had spent months warning Hitler that the invasion would come through Normandy. He had built defenses, laid millions of mines, and fortified the coastline. But even Rommel knew the truth. The Atlantic Wall could only hold if the enemy was stopped on the beaches. Once the Allies broke through, Germany's defeat was only a matter of time. Hitler, however, was asleep when the invasion began. His generals refused to wake him. Critical hours were lost as armored divisions waited for permission to move. By the time orders were issued, the tide had turned. The Allies were dug in, their supply lines open, their naval guns protecting the coast. The Germans counterattacked with everything they had. Panzer divisions rolled toward the front, their tracks grinding through the ruins of French villages. But Allied air power dominated the skies. Fighter bombers hunted tanks relentlessly. Every convoy that moved by day was destroyed from above. The once feared Wehrmacht was bleeding strength it could not replace. Still, the fighting on the ground was brutal. The Normandy countryside, known as the bocage, was a nightmare for soldiers and tanks alike. Thick hedgerows, ancient stone walls, and narrow lanes turned every field into a fortress. Progress was measured in meters, not miles. Entire days were spent fighting for a single farmhouse. The city of Caen, one of the Allies' main objectives, became a symbol of the slow, grinding battle that followed D-Day. British and Canadian forces fought for weeks to take it, facing some of the best German divisions, veterans of the Eastern Front. By the time the city finally fell, it was reduced to rubble. Meanwhile, American forces were pushing west toward Cherbourg, the critical deep-water port needed to supply the invasion. The Germans had fortified the city heavily, turning it into a citadel. But the Americans pressed forward relentlessly. Artillery, naval bombardments, and fierce infantry assaults, finally cracked the defenses. On June 27, 1944, Cherbourg fell. With the port secured, the Allies could now feed their growing army across the Channel. Supplies flowed in: tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, fuel, everything needed for a continental campaign. And that campaign was about to explode. In late July, after nearly 2 months of deadlock, the Allies unleashed Operation Cobra. Thousands of bombers darkened the sky, saturating German lines with high explosives. When the dust settled, the American army surged forward. The breakout from Normandy had begun. Columns of Sherman tanks and mechanized infantry punched through the shattered front. German units, battered and disorganized, tried to retreat, but they were too slow. The Allies moved faster, cutting roads and circling entire divisions. The pocket at Falaise became a slaughterhouse. Tens of thousands of German soldiers trapped, shelled, and destroyed from the air and ground alike. By August, the German army in Normandy was in full retreat. Paris rose in resistance. Within weeks, the city was liberated. Crowds cheered as Allied columns rolled through the streets. But for the men who had fought from the beaches to the capital, the joy was tempered by exhaustion. The cost of victory was immense, and the war was not yet over. To the east, the German army was falling back toward the Seine, regrouping for what Hitler promised would be a final defense of the Reich. But the truth was clear to everyone. D-Day had done what it was meant to do. The invasion had torn open Fortress Europe. The road to Germany was open. Behind every victory was the same truth Yamamoto had once recognized across the Pacific. Industrial power wins wars. Every tank, every rifle, every landing craft that crossed the Channel was the product of Allied factories running day and night. America, Britain, and Canada had built not just armies, but entire systems of logistics that could sustain them indefinitely. The summer of 1944 became a rolling wave of liberation across Western Europe. After the breakout from Normandy, the Allied advance gathered speed that no one, not even their own commanders, had anticipated. What had once been a cautious crawl through the hedgerows became a thunderous pursuit across open countryside. The German army, shattered by weeks of relentless combat, was retreating in chaos. Columns of American tanks under General George S. Patton's Third Army surged eastward. Patton's men drove day and night, sleeping in their tanks, refueling on the move, smashing through German positions before the defenders could organize. In less than 2 weeks, they advanced over 100 miles. Roads were choked with German prisoners, wrecked vehicles, and abandoned artillery. To the north, the British and Canadians pushed hard toward the Falaise pocket. German forces trapped inside, remnants of once proud panzer divisions, fought desperately to escape. The air was filled with smoke, the stench of burning fuel and flesh. Allied aircraft circled like vultures, strafing columns of retreating soldiers. When it was over, tens of thousands of German troops were dead or captured. Normandy had become their grave. By late August, the road to Paris lay open. Inside the city, the French resistance had risen. For 4 long years, they had waited, planned, and fought in the shadows. Now, as the Allies approached, they struck openly, sabotaging railways, ambushing German patrols, seizing police stations. The people of Paris took to the streets, waving tricolor flags, building barricades, and shouting the words they had whispered in secret for years. Vive la France! The German commander in Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, had orders from Hitler to destroy the city, to leave it a field of rubble. Bridges, monuments, and power plants were to be blown up before surrender. But Choltitz, a career officer who understood the war was lost, could not bring himself to destroy one of Europe's greatest cities. He defied the Führer's orders. On August 25, 1944, the French 2nd Armored Division under General Philippe Leclerc rolled into Paris, alongside the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. Crowds flooded the streets, embracing soldiers, throwing flowers, weeping with joy. Church bells rang across the city for the first time since 1940. The nightmare of occupation was over. For the Allies, Paris was not just a victory of arms, but of morale. It was proof that liberation was possible, that Europe could be free. But even as celebrations erupted, the commanders knew the war was far from done. The Wehrmacht was battered but not broken. The Reich still had vast armies, vast resources, and fanatical loyalty to Hitler. Ahead lay the Siegfried Line, the fortified wall guarding Germany itself. Patton's armored spearheads pressed on toward the Rhine. But speed came with a cost. Fuel was running dangerously low. The Allied supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles to the beaches of Normandy. Every gallon of gasoline, every shell, every meal had to cross roads cratered by bombs, bridges destroyed by retreating Germans, and choke points packed with traffic. The Allied advance stalled in September, not because of German strength, but because of logistics. The tanks that had swept across France now sat idle, waiting for fuel that couldn't arrive fast enough. Eisenhower's vast army had outrun its lifeline. At the same time, the British launched Operation Market Garden, one of the most ambitious and risky plans of the war. The idea was daring: seize a series of bridges across the Netherlands using paratroopers, then rush ground forces north to cross the Rhine and invade Germany before winter. The skies once again filled with parachutes. Thousands of Allied soldiers dropped behind enemy lines, capturing key bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. But the Germans recovered faster than expected. At Arnhem, British paratroopers were cut off and surrounded by 2 SS Panzer divisions. They fought heroically for 9 days, outnumbered and outgunned, until they were finally overwhelmed. The operation failed. The Allies would not cross the Rhine in 1944. The dream of ending the war by Christmas died in the fields of Holland. As autumn fell, the Allied front stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The armies dug in, preparing for winter. They believed the Germans were beaten, that they were simply waiting for the final push into the heart of the Reich. But they were wrong. Deep in the forests of Western Germany, Hitler was planning one last gamble, an offensive so bold and unexpected that it could change the course of the war. He called it Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. The objective: to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. In December 1944, under the cover of fog and snow, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers gathered in the Ardennes. Their tanks were hidden beneath trees, their movements masked by bad weather that grounded Allied aircraft. It was a plan born of desperation, but also of cunning. The Allies believed the Ardennes was impassable for tanks. They had left it lightly defended, guarded mostly by exhausted and inexperienced troops. At dawn on December 16th, the forest erupted with artillery. Thousands of shells screamed through the mist, pounding American positions. German tanks and infantry surged forward. The surprise was total. Entire American units were overrun, roads clogged with retreating soldiers and burning vehicles. The front collapsed. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The first days of the Battle of the Bulge were chaos, utter confusion in the frozen Ardennes. The quiet sector that had been considered a place for rest and refit. exploded into the most violent surprise attack the Americans had faced since Pearl Harbor. Snow fell thick across the pines, muffling the rumble of engines and the crack of gunfire. The Germans advanced through the white wilderness like ghosts, their tanks marked with pine branches for camouflage, their infantry wearing stolen American uniforms to sow confusion. In the first 24 hours, the German 5th and 6th Panzer armies smashed through thin American lines. Towns that had barely appeared on maps, St. Vith, Clairvaux, Losheim, suddenly became names burned into history. Units like the U.S. 106th Infantry Division, barely a month in combat, were encircled and destroyed. Thousands were taken prisoner. American artillerymen fought until their guns were surrounded, firing point-blank into the fog. By December 17th, the situation had become desperate. German spearheads were driving west toward the Meuse River, threatening to split the Allied front in two. But in their path lay a crossroads town that would become legendary: Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had just returned to France for rest when the order came: move to Bastogne. Hold the town at all costs. They arrived in open trucks, shivering in the freezing wind, many without winter gear, short on food, low on ammunition. The roads were jammed with refugees and retreating soldiers, the sky thick with falling snow. Yet when they reached Bastogne, they dug in. On December 19th, the German 5th Panzer Army surrounded the town bemined completely. Bastogne became an island in a sea of enemies. 7 roads converged there, and holding them meant holding the key to the Ardennes. The 101st, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and other units, numbered barely 12,000 men. The Germans had more than 50,000 troops and hundreds of tanks. The siege began. Days passed in blizzards and bitter cold. Wounded soldiers lay freezing in makeshift aid stations, wrapped in blankets that stiffened with ice. Ammunition dwindled. Rations were cut to half, then quarter. Medical supplies ran out. The only warmth came from burning wreckage and shared body heat in foxholes dug into the frozen soil. On December 22nd, under a white flag, 2 German officers approached the American lines. They carried a written demand for surrender. To the U.S. commander of Bastogne, it read, "The fortune of war is changing. There is only one possibility to save the encircled U.S. troops: honorable surrender." It warned that if the town did not yield, it would be annihilated by artillery. The note was taken to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st. He read it, laughed, and scribbled his reply on the back: "Nuts." The stunned German officers asked for clarification. Colonel Joseph Harper explained, "It means go to hell." When the message was delivered, American morale soared. The men in the foxholes laughed for the first time in days. They knew their commander wasn't giving up, and neither would they. Meanwhile, relief was on its way. General Patton, who had been planning an attack in another sector, performed one of the most astonishing feats of maneuver in military history. Within 48 hours, he turned his entire Third Army north, 3 divisions pivoting in the snow, hundreds of tanks grinding through ice and mud to relieve Bastogne. On December 26th, tanks from the 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines and reached the besieged town. The road was open. The defenders had held. The Battle of the Bulge raged on for weeks. Fighting in places like St. Vith, Houffalize, and the Elsenborn Ridge turned towns into ruins. The weather, at first the Germans' greatest ally, soon became their downfall. When the skies cleared, Allied aircraft returned in force: Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Typhoons screaming over the snow-covered forests, blasting tanks and convoys. By January 1945, the bulge in the Allied line had been erased. The Germans had spent their last reserves of men, tanks, and fuel. What had begun as a daring counterattack ended as catastrophe. The cost was staggering. The U.S. Army suffered over 80,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans lost nearly 100,000. Entire villages were leveled. Civilians froze or starved in the fighting. But the failure of the offensive sealed Germany's fate. The Reich would never again take the initiative in the West. In the East, the Soviet Union was already preparing its final assault on Berlin. The Red Army was rolling across Poland, unstoppable, its front stretching hundreds of miles. The Germans were caught between two titans, and both were closing in. As the Allies pushed across the Rhine in March 1945, the end of Nazi Germany became a matter of time. American engineers built floating bridges across the river while artillery pounded the far bank. In one remarkable stroke of luck, U.S. troops captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact. Within hours, tanks and infantry were streaming into the heart of Germany. Cities fell one after another: Cologne, Frankfurt, Nuremberg. The skies above the Reich were black with bombers, the night illuminated by firestorms. By April, Allied forces had encircled the Ruhr industrial region, capturing hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. The once proud Wehrmacht was disintegrating. Hitler retreated to his bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. Above him, the city burned. Soviet artillery was pounding the streets, buildings collapsing under relentless bombardment. The last defenders were boys from the Hitler Youth, old men from the Volkssturm, SS fanatics with nothing left to lose. As the smoke of battle lifted over Europe, the guns fell silent. The war that had consumed continents, that had turned cities to ash and generations to ghosts, was finally ending. On May 7th, 1945, in a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, Germany signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender. The following day, May 8th, VE Day, the world exhaled. Church bells rang. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, and New York. Men who had survived the unimaginable wept openly. Women clung to the returning ghosts of boys who had left as soldiers and come back as something else. Older, quieter, forever changed. But victory had come at a terrible cost. Entire divisions had been wiped out in the forests of the Ardennes. Thousands lay beneath the snow in unmarked graves. The Battle of the Bulge had been the last great gamble of the Third Reich, and it had failed. Hitler was dead, his empire in ruins, his vision of conquest shattered by the courage of ordinary men who refused to yield, even when surrounded, freezing, and outgunned. Bastogne, once just another small town in Belgium, became a symbol of grit, of defiance, of what happens when the human spirit says no to impossible odds. Men who had held the line there didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of each other, of the man beside them in the foxhole, of getting through just one more day. But history remembers them differently. It remembers them as the reason the line held. In the end, the Allied victory wasn't just won by strategy or by tanks or by bombers. It was won by endurance, by the unbreakable will of men who refused to surrender, who dug into frozen soil and told the world, "You shall not pass." Today, the forests of the Ardennes are quiet. The foxholes still scar the ground, now filled with rainwater and leaves. Beneath the trees lie the remains of boys who never came home. The wind carries the faint echo of artillery long gone. And yet, in that silence, the story endures, because the Battle of the Bulge wasn't just the story of a fight, it was the story of resilience, of courage born from desperation, of men who, when faced with annihilation, chose to fight back. If this story moved you, take a moment to remember them. Like this video to honor their memory, and subscribe to hear more untold stories of World War II, the battles, the machines, and the men who changed history. Share this with someone who still believes that courage is something from another time. Because it isn't. It's still here, quiet, steady, waiting for the moment when it's needed most. And as you move to the next video, whether it's the Battle of Midway, Stalingrad, or the untold story of the men who fought in the Pacific, remember this: history doesn't live in books or museums. It lives in us, every time we remember. This is their legacy. This is our duty. Never forget.